Welcome to We Caribbean, a special program in which we discuss and analyze the issues affecting the region, giving a voice to those who are impacted. It's their concerns, their issues, and their triumphs. On We Caribbean, I'm your host, Doris Polo. Now, this week, things are looking a bit different because obviously the coronavirus pandemic has affected us here at Telesur English. And so we'll be taking our interview directly to our guests via Zoom. Thank you so much for joining us. We have with us Dr. Taisha Maddox. She is an assistant professor at Fordham University, specializing in African American studies as well as Caribbean immigration. And we also have attorney practicing civil law as well as immigration law, Onika Roach Campbell, joining us both from the United States. Thank you, ladies, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
So we've seen a ripple effect across the globe with the brutal murder of George Floyd that was captured on tape. The incident occurred on May 25th, but it spread across the globe. Dr. Maddox, what are your thoughts on this particular incident as we move on into this discussion?
Well, I think this incident it kind of shows that it's not an isolation one. And I think that's something that the protests in the US and around the world have shown, that although this was a horrific murder of George Floyd, that this is a systemic issue that has been happening throughout US history for a very long time, and has touched the Black community in ways that they're just fed up now, and they can't take it anymore. So this is a larger issue rooted in racial and structural racism within the United States.
Onika, what can you tell us about how systemic racism affects not only the African diaspora, but also the Caribbean community in the United States?
Well, when we look at, say, systemic racism, it's everywhere. And unfortunately, when we look at the people that come from the Caribbean, we all have many different colors, many different races, and many different creeds. But when we come to the United States is very binary in its relation to race. So a lot of times you're either Black or you're white. A lot of times there's no in between. So we see a lot of the Caribbean Blacks, whether they identify as African American or not, they're thrown into that big bucket and they're treated the same, or even sometimes worse. I hate to hear when African descent people from the Caribbean say, well, I'm Black, but I'm not African American. We're all one and the same, and that division, divide and conquer, it's been an old rule that they've always used against us. So we're all in the same bucket.
Yeah, Dr. Maddox, now, we've seen the Caribbean community short in their numbers. A lot of them would have taken to the streets in Brooklyn recently to protest these murders. And I mean, it wasn't just George Floyd. It would have been the Ahmaud Arbery, the Breonna Taylor. We've had the latest one, Rashad. It really has caused people to turn out and call for and enter this sort of racist action against Black people in the United States. But the protests were peaceful. There was soca music playing, people had their flags, and they marched peacefully. So how does that really lend to how Caribbean people would have contributed to this sort of action, especially because Caribbean people have been particularly involved in the U.S. civil rights movement? We've had Marcus Garvey, Kwame Ture from Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica, respectively, taking part in these sorts of demonstrations. How does this differ to the narrative that all these protests are violent and there's looting? What are your thoughts on what I just mentioned?
Okay, so I thought personally that the rally on Sunday was amazing to see. It was hosted by Caribbean Americans for Justice, and I believe the Caribbean Guyanese Institute for Democracy. And so they came together and told everyone to come down, bring your signs to show solidarity, bring your flags to show that we as Caribbean people, we are part of American history and we want to be part of the action to correct these injustices within the American system. So I thought it was amazing to see. It was very peaceful. It was a protest done only in the way that Caribbean people can do a protest.
Definitely.
There was soca music being played. There were people standing in solidarity with the larger Black community. And I just thought it was amazing to see. There were so many people that came out. I don't know what the official numbers are yet, but just from the pictures, I wasn't able to make it, but just from the pictures that were shown, it had to be at least tens of thousands of people. And
When I saw it,
yeah,
I said, oh my gosh, this is carnival, except without the costumes.
but with a little bit of a higher purpose.
Definitely a higher purpose.
Yes,
of course, that can't be ignored.
And I think it was, oh, sorry, go ahead.
You go ahead.
No, I was going to say, and I think one of the issues that we often hear, oh, well, in the Caribbean, we are a racial democracy. We don't have these kind of issues of injustice in the Caribbean, which is not necessarily true. And on the larger scale, every Caribbean person has a family member that lives in the U.S. So there is a connection to the U.S. Even if we look at the case of Botham Jean, right? He is a St. Lucia national, and even his life was affected by this police brutality in the U.S., right? And so that sparked a larger issue and conversation about race in the U.S., race in the Caribbean. The fact that this Caribbean national who had come to the U.S. was murdered by an off-duty police officer. So I think just making those connections are really important for the Caribbean community.
Yeah, and it's important to note that when you mentioned the history of Caribbean people and the protest being in a way that only Caribbean people can protest, you know, Carnival was born out of slavery.
Yes.
People took to the streets for that one period of time as slaves to participate in a peaceful sort of demonstration, and also a sort of mockery of their their owners and the plantation owners. And now we've seen it take place now in modern day protests in the United States. So it really was interesting to see. Now, Onika, my next question to you regarding the demonstrations that would have taken place in the United States. You mentioned earlier that there tends to be some sort of a disjoint between people who live in the Caribbean and people who live in the United States or other first world countries as it relates to being Black. How do you think people from the Caribbean who might migrate to the United States, migrate to England, Canada, address racism as opposed to people who would have been living there for ages?
I'm glad that you asked that question. You know, we just like in any other cultures, there are many different subgroups, right? When from the outside looking in, you just look and everyone looks like they're Black. But when we break the subcultures down, we have, you know, Blacks from the Caribbean. We also have who say, oh, I'm not African American, I'm Afro-Caribbean. We also have Africans from the motherland that refuse to identify either African Americans or African Caribbeans. Give for example, when I went to college, I was rooming with an African American girl, and we had an argument. She said, you know what, you just need to go back to Africa. And I said, I don't understand, you know, because in Trinidad, you know, we all look the same. Hey, and I had just come to the US not too long. So definitely just being able to identify and appreciate the differences, but coming together in unity is important. I think until we are able as a Caribbean community to address and to be honest with ourselves, because I will always bring up Trinidad and Tobago because that's where I'm from. When this whole issue with George Floyd started and people started to march in the streets in Trinidad and Tobago calling for Black Lives Matter, we've seen a lot of the comments on Facebook and a lot of the things that come back. They say, oh, you know, in Trinidad, every creed and race find an equal place. Why are we involved with this American system? But let's be real, you know, just like when we talk about Alcoholics Anonymous, for example, the first thing you have to do is to fix a problem is to address that the problem exists, right? When you go to Alcoholics Anonymous, the first thing you say is, hi, my name is whoever, and I'm an alcoholic. But I think the problem with the Caribbean and why a lot of times, a lot of people in the Caribbean feel like we can't identify with it because we're not willing to address the fact that we have our own racial problems, you know, in the Caribbean, especially in Trinidad and Tobago. We divide in political lines by race. And I don't understand why, you know, it rears its head when we start talking about politics. There's a racial base, and it doesn't matter how educated the person is, it doesn't matter what their qualifications are. we sit here and we look at, okay, well, I want this person because they're East Indian. I want this person because they're African. Not looking at the fact that if when we come to America and we look at the binary system, we would all be considered people of color. The Indians in Trinidad, the Syrians in Trinidad, the African people in Trinidad, we're all people of color. So like, what are we arguing about? So I think for people from the Caribbean and other areas that just come to the US, it's kind of difficult for them to identify.
Like a culture shock.
Yeah, it's a culture shock. But I think after being here for years and then, of course, having children, American children, because I have 4 American children in my house. They're Trinidadian descent, but they were born here. And seeing the differences in how they're treated and understanding that, yes, there is a disparity, not only in police brutality, but in schooling. You know, I spoke a little bit earlier to you about the difficulty that I had even finding a home. You know, when I first moved to Utica, New York, I live in an area, it's New Hartford and Utica. And New Hartford is mostly white, and Utica is where most of the immigrants and the Black people live. However, when we look at how the school systems are funded, the schools in Utica don't have anything that they need. They hardly have any supplies. Kids have to test into AP courses. And then right across the line, literally across the train tracks, you have New Hartford, where my son is one of only 3 African-American children in his school. And they have international language labs and children. We moved from Texas, where we had to test into, because we were in a Black community, the children had to test into AP courses, which is the advanced placement courses. Whereas in the white community, where we are, like I said, we're very much a minority, 1 of 3 students in the entire school, all the children are allowed to take AP if they want to. So when we look at systemically, when we bring that forward, for example, we can look at when it's time to apply for colleges. This child who was in the New Hartford system, or in a system where they are fully funded, their transcript looks pretty good. They get scholarships and everything. Whereas many of the African-American children who may have been just as smart, right, did not get the opportunity because they didn't test well. So it starts, you know, this is a conversation I think the whole thing with George Floyd opened up, but it starts from the bottom, even from housing to schooling to, we say that there's no segregation, but segregation is still real. It's just, you know, a different format.
Thank you so much.
Can I just add to that? I agree
of course.
completely with you that the idea is systemic, right? Is that it permeates in every aspect of American life for Black people, including all the areas that you mentioned: education, health, housing. It permeates every single function of American life for Black people. So I agree completely.
Yeah.
Thank you guys so much. We will be taking a short break now, and we'll be back after this.
Follow our program minute by minute. Our signal in audio format is now also available on our website. Get the latest updated facts and news emerging around the world from a Latin American reliable angle. Telesur, connecting the global south.
Welcome back. With me discussing the ongoing protests against the brutal murder of George Floyd and racism in the United States and around the world is Dr. Taisha Maddox and Onika Roach Campbell. You guys, thank you so much for staying with us.
Thank you.
Now, my next question will be directed to you, Dr. Maddox. With regards to capitalism, earlier I was mentioning to you before we started recording that a lot of businesses would have benefited from slavery in the United States and in the United Kingdom. A lot of these global countries, France, for example, would have benefited from colonization, which had its effects, implications for people living in the Caribbean who then migrated to the United States. What do you think can be done going forward to close the gap that has widened so greatly between poorer people who are of different races, poorer people of color, Black people, and white people?
So I think one of the demands of the protesters, one of the demands that aren't talked about as much, is that there's a real push for reparations. And this is not a new debate, right? This is not a new debate in the Caribbean or in the US. There have been committees put together and studies shown how reparations would immediately and effectively help these communities, lower income Black communities, in terms of pooling resources for health, education, housing, investing in Black communities, helping Black business owners. And I think that's definitely a way in which we can help close some of that gap. I think people who argue against reparations are saying that why should we give a cash handout to these people? What does that help? And I think we need to, one, not think of it necessarily as a cash handout. Yes, that is part of it, and it is important. But we need to think of the larger structural things that need to be changed within these communities to help. And I think that that is definitely a start. I'm trying to remember the rest of your question, though. I'm sorry.
It was really, you actually answered the question, because it was really to find out what can be done going forward to close the gap between people of poorer races, essentially, who are in the United States. I mean, what are your thoughts on the fact that these statues and street names and building names continue to exist post-colonization? What does this mean for African identity and for Caribbean people who really want to assume their own identities that are going forward?
Well, for one, I would like to say that, until the people that are unaffected by the issue start standing up and recognizing, because it's one of those things where Africans and also African Caribbean people, we're forced to live in this world that's not catered to us. So we're constantly having to, it's okay. Yeah, that's, this is a remnant of colonization. These people beat, murdered, looted, and killed our grandfathers and grandmothers. But it's okay that we have this big statue to them, in the middle of the square and things like that. So we have to look at the fact that what is the mental trauma that, as an African American, I am experiencing every time I see that statue, or I have to go to that school that's named after Christopher Columbus. So we have to look at those issues, and until we look at those and we address those, people will always feel that a certain race is higher and a certain race is lower. Even in the example of the school system, why is it that I'm addressing the American system, right? In February we have Black History Month, but why isn't Black history being taught in schools all year long? Why aren't we learning about the people in African American history that made contributions to the world as a whole? So as a child growing up, you're being programmed to believe that your people did nothing for the world, when we know that's not to be true. I remember even growing up in Trinidad and Tobago, and I went to Mova Anglican School, but I also went to high school at St. Augustine Girls. And it wasn't just at my school, it was just high school altogether. I don't know about you, but I don't remember learning anything much about Marcus Garvey or any of these people that were instrumental in changing the world. So just like we spoke about earlier, and I think everything is going back to, the system. So you have, I think she mentioned earlier about the reparations. Right?
Mm-hmm.
People are saying, you're trying to come with this whole socialist, we don't need socialism in America. It's not about that. What we're looking at is people who have this difference in wealth and being rich, right? Wealth is more of generational, right? It's passed down. So they use our people to build their countries, to build these systems, and to gain this wealth. And now we have no part in it. And a lot of people say, well, it's impossible to do that. How do we know who to send money to and things like that? I would argue that is not, it's not impossible. because I work with the refugee community all the time. I being an immigration attorney. So instead of, gentrification, where you go into these communities and you take away property from poor blacks and you regentrify and then you sell it back to, rich white people who have this generational wealth, why not do the same thing that you're doing for the refugees? Because African Americans are refugees in our own land.
Yeah. Dr. Maddox, how do you think Caribbean people could assist the wider African American community in pushing for change?
Oh, that's a big question. That's definitely a big question. Let me think about that. I think one in acknowledging acknowledging the racial injustice in our own communities first
Definitely.
is helpful in starting to recognize it in the larger world, that it's not just an issue in the US. So for instance, I've been following closely, because I have a lot of friends in the UK, following closely the protests there. And while they are in solidarity with what is happening in the US and ending the racial injustice and police brutality and over-policing of communities in the US, the British protesters are also taking Great Britain at hand and saying, well, we're not perfect either. We have issues here. And the same in France with Black Lives Matters protesters who are protesting in France. They're saying, wait, let's look at ourselves first and let's fix what's happening here so that we aren't like what's happening in the US and we don't echo that. And so I think for the Caribbean, I think we can first acknowledge the issues that we have within the Caribbean and work to fix those issues. And then of course, lending platforms to Caribbean Americans, trying to support the cause in any way that they see fit, whether that's volunteering time, volunteering space, volunteering or monetarily, sending money. I think there are a number of ways in which that could be done to show.
Most definitely.
Yeah.
So my last question to both of you, since we are running out of time, we've seen protesters. Now, a lot of the protests have been peaceful, but as well, a lot of people have been accosted by police officers who were violent towards them. It paints a different picture to the United States of America that as children, people in the Caribbean and third world countries would have heard about, especially what was perpetuated by the media. So the question really is, how will the events that are taking place in the United States at this point in time affect immigration trends going forward? How will Caribbean people perceive the United States? And we can start with you, Onika.
Well, first of all, what I'd like to say is that it's already affecting. Right now, we have the USCIS, who is the organization that does all of the applications and things for people coming to the US, and they're funded by applications. So a lot of the people that used to be applying to come to the US, you remember in Trinidad, you have the long line around the savannah, and they take all the money, and maybe 2 or 3 people get approved for the day. But that's another injustice and another topic that we can talk about later. But right now, we already have where that agency is saying that they're going to run out of money and they're going to have to close their doors soon because they don't have enough applications coming in. So here we have, where Donald Trump and other politicians are saying, oh, we don't need immigrants, especially from these shithole countries and things like that. But it turns out that they actually do need the immigrants, and we are affecting, and where we spend our dollar is affecting whether or not they're able to keep the agency open. So what I'd say is that I have seen a downtick in the number of people that even want to come visit. Right now, I have people that are in the US that are trying to figure out how to go home, without being barred from coming back later when things get better. I think Caribbean people are wise, and we're looking at, okay, right now we're under a certain administration, and with this administration, this is happening. For the first time in history, we have a president who's actually in the bunker hiding from his own people, right? So the Caribbean people are recognizing and realizing that this is something that it's going on. It's probably going to last for a while, but it won't last forever. And they're refusing to spend their money on even attempting to come to America. Right now, they want to pay me to help them figure out how to go home without it affecting them. Yeah.
Dr. Maddox, your comments on that question?
So like these are people that are literally risking their lives and their health so that we, the American people, can shelter in place and stay at home safely during this pandemic. They're also providing our food for us in terms of like the immigrant workers who work in the agricultural industry.
Yeah.
So to say that these immigrants are not necessary is completely ridiculous. But back to your other question, this idea of what image of the US will this leave people with, I think this idea of America as being a place of opportunity, of having this American dream, I think it's seriously shown some holes in that theory the last few years. The fact that we're trying to protest peacefully, we're trying to assert our First Amendment rights to assemble, and police officers are violently shutting down protests that are not violent, that are not causing any harm. I think that shows that there are issues with this idea of America as being the place of equal opportunity, of being able to work by your bootstraps and be able to pull yourself up. When Breonna Taylor is working as an essential worker and an EMS worker, she's at home in her house doing everything right, and she's still killed. So I think that will definitely put pause to a lot of people before they think. And I've heard people say, well, I don't want to go to America. I'm Black. I'm going to get shot. And so I think there's going to be a lot more of that unless we do something serious to affect some change. And I think these protests are starting to definitely turn that table right now.
And to add quickly to what you said, the comparison, right? Because we're peacefully or trying to peacefully protest, and we're being shot with tear gas and rubber bullets. But we recently had a group of white protesters who staged like ran into the state building in Michigan with rifles, exactly. Right? Assault rifles, and they were treated. They weren't tear gassed. They weren't rubber bulleted, you know?
The hypocrisy of that is that the president, when that happened in Michigan, he said to the governor, Governor Whitmer, he said, well, why don't you have a sit down with these people and meet them halfway? Yes. Yet when people are protesting peacefully outside the White House, he sends out the National Guard to
disperse them,
shut them down, and he pulls a fence around the White House. So the same way he said to Governor Whitmer, why don't you invite these people to have a conversation with them? Black people who are fighting for our lives. These people were fighting for haircuts and to go to a bar.
Right.
People who are fighting to end police brutality are shot down, like, well, not literally, but shot down and told, you know, they can't protest.
Well, literally,
which is their constitutional right.
Bullets, rubber bullets.
Yes. And with that,
they admitted to using chemical agents. They admitted to using tear gas.
I mean, thank you both so much for joining us and speaking on this very real issue. We've heard so many times that the United States of America is the land of the free and the home for the brave, but really we are seeing an alternative reality with the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Rayshard Brooks. And it's important that we continue to highlight and put attention on these issues as Caribbean people who are also subjected to this sort of a racist system that exists not only in the United States, but other countries across the world. Thank you so much, Onika Roach Campbell, attorney practicing civil law, as well as an immigration attorney in the United States, and Dr. Maddox. Thank you guys so much for joining us.
Thank you for inviting us. It was a pleasure.
And as such, we've come to the end of this edition of We Caribbean. For more, you can visit our website at tellusenglish.net, as well as we are on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For We Caribbean, I'm your host, Doris Polo.